November 14th, 1987, 3:22 a.m. Somewhere in the Norwegian Sea, 40 miles off the coast of Tromsø. Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes pressed his headphones tighter against his skull, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. For 16 years, he had tracked Soviet submarines through the dark waters of the North Atlantic. He knew every signature, every pattern, every mechanical heartbeat of the Red Fleet. But tonight, something was wrong. 3 hours ago, SOSUS, the Navy's underwater listening network stretching from Greenland to Scotland, had detected a Soviet submarine surfacing near the Kola Peninsula. Standard protocol. The Soviets had done this 1,000 times before. Hayes and his team aboard the USS Augusta had been dispatched to shadow the contact as it moved into open water. But now there was nothing. The submarine had simply vanished. "Sir," his sonar operator whispered, fear creeping into his voice, "I'm getting nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's like it was never there." Hayes felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. In 16 years, he had never lost a contact. Soviet submarines were loud. They rumbled through the ocean like freight trains, their reactor coolant pumps screaming their position to anyone with ears to listen. American submarines had tracked them, mocked them, circled them like wolves around wounded prey. But this was different. Somewhere in the darkness below, a Soviet submarine was hunting. And for the first time in the Cold War, the hunter had become the hunted. What Lieutenant Commander Hayes didn't know, what nobody in the United States Navy knew yet, was that they were witnessing the birth of a technological revolution. A revolution that would cost American taxpayers $800 million to counter. A revolution built by Soviet engineers in a crumbling shipyard, using technology older than the space shuttle for less than $90 million per hull. The submarine was called Akula. In Russian, it means shark. And the shark had just learned how to become invisible. If you're fascinated by stories of Cold War espionage, technological warfare, and the high-stakes game of cat and mouse that nearly brought two superpowers to nuclear annihilation, then hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about American naval supremacy. And while you're at it, drop a like on this video. It helps more people discover stories like this one. Now, let's go back. Let's go back to understand how a bankrupt communist nation managed to build a weapon so terrifying that it kept Pentagon admirals awake at night for a decade. To understand the Akula, you need to understand the ocean itself. Sound travels through water at approximately 1,500 meters per second, 4 times faster than through air. In the depths of the sea, where light cannot penetrate, sound is everything. It is how submarines hunt. It is how they hide. It is how they kill. For decades, the United States had dominated this acoustic battlefield. American submarines were the quietest in the world, gliding through the deep like ghosts, while Soviet vessels announced their presence like marching bands at a funeral. The reason was simple: American manufacturing precision. Every submarine creates noise. Propellers cavitate, creating tiny bubbles that collapse with audible pops. Reactor coolant pumps hum at specific frequencies. Turbines whine with characteristic signatures. Hull plates flex and groan under pressure changes. A submarine is a symphony of mechanical sounds. And in the Cold War, the orchestra that played softest survived longest. American engineers had spent billions perfecting the art of silence. They machined propeller blades to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. They mounted equipment on rubber shock absorbers that swallowed vibrations before they could reach the hull. They lined their boats with anechoic tiles that absorbed sound like sponges absorbing water. The Soviets, by contrast, seemed incapable of such precision. Their submarines were loud, so loud that American sonar operators joked they could track a Soviet Victor class from halfway across the Atlantic with one ear tied behind their back. The SOSUS network, that chain of hydrophones stretching across the ocean floor like tripwires, detected Soviet submarines the moment they left port. It was a complete mismatch, a technological rout. American naval supremacy was unquestioned, unchallengeable, absolute. And then, in 1984, something changed. The first reports came from a patrol submarine operating near the Barents Sea. The crew detected what they initially believed to be a biological contact, perhaps a whale or a school of fish. The signature was too faint, too inconsistent to be anything mechanical. But the contact moved with purpose. It maintained depth with impossible consistency. It altered course in response to their movements, as if it could sense them watching. It was a submarine, a Soviet submarine, and it was quieter than anything they had ever heard. The report landed on the desk of Rear Admiral William Studeman, the Director of Naval Intelligence. Studeman was a careful man, not prone to alarm or exaggeration. He had built his career on sober analysis, on separating signal from noise in the chaos of intelligence gathering. But as he read the patrol report, his blood ran cold. "Confirm this," he ordered his staff. I want every asset we have looking for these boats. I want to know everything about them, sonar signatures, operating patterns, capabilities, everything. But what he didn't realize was that finding them would be almost impossible, because the Soviets hadn't just built a new submarine. They had built a new category of warfare. The Akula-class submarine, designated Project 971 by the Soviet Navy, codenamed Shchuka B, or Pike, was unlike anything that had come before. At 110 meters long and displacing over 8,000 tons submerged, it was a true attack submarine, designed with a single purpose: to hunt and kill American ballistic missile submarines, the crown jewels of nuclear deterrence, the ultimate guarantee of mutual destruction. But its most revolutionary feature was invisible. Its most revolutionary feature was silence. Soviet engineers had finally cracked the code that had eluded them for decades. They had lined the Akula's double hull with a new generation of rubber anechoic tiles, each one carefully tuned to absorb specific frequencies of active sonar. The tiles weren't just stuck to the hull, they were integrated into its very structure, creating a seamless barrier between the submarine and the listening ocean. Inside the hull, engineers had mounted the reactor on a floating raft, a massive platform suspended from the boat's frame by rubber shock mounts that swallowed vibration like a sponge swallowing water. The reactor could run at full power, and the sound that reached the outer hull was reduced by orders of magnitude. They had replaced noisy reduction gears with a new electric drive propulsion system. Traditional submarine propulsion channeled energy from the reactor through mechanical gears to the propeller shaft, and those gears created noise. The Akula's designers eliminated that entire pathway, using electric motors that transmitted almost nothing to the outside world. And the propeller was a masterpiece. For decades, propeller design had been the Soviet Navy's Achilles heel. American propellers were machined on computer-controlled milling machines capable of extraordinary precision. Each blade was identical to within fractions of a millimeter. The result was a propeller that cut through water with minimal turbulence, creating almost no detectable noise. Soviet propellers, by contrast, were crude by comparison. Their manufacturing processes lacked the precision necessary for quiet operation. Uneven blades created turbulence and cavitation, tiny bubbles that formed in low-pressure zones and collapsed with audible pops. American sonar could detect that noise from miles away. But in 1981, everything changed. In 1981, the Soviets got help from an unexpected source. A Japanese company called Toshiba and a Norwegian firm called Kongsberg had secretly sold the Soviet Union a set of 9-axis computer-controlled milling machines. These weren't ordinary machine tools. They were among the most advanced manufacturing systems in the world, capable of machining complex curved surfaces to tolerances measured in microns. The technology was cutting edge. It was restricted under COCOM regulations, the International Export Control Agreement designed specifically to prevent strategic technology from reaching the Soviet bloc. The sale was illegal. It was a violation of international law. It was, by any reasonable definition, an act of industrial treachery. And it changed the course of the Cold War. With those milling machines, Soviet engineers could finally manufacture propeller blades with the precision they had always lacked. They could create the complex curved surfaces necessary for silent operation. They could, at last, build a submarine that could slip through American detection networks like a knife through water. The first Akula-class submarine rolled out of the Komsomolsk on Amur shipyard in 1984. By 1986, it had completed sea trials. The results exceeded every expectation. By 1987, it was hunting American submarines in their own waters. Now here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. What the CIA discovered about the Akula didn't just concern them, it terrified them, because the implications went far beyond one submarine class. The implications struck at the very heart of American nuclear strategy. You see, the United States had built its entire nuclear deterrent around one assumption: that American ballistic missile submarines, the boomers, could hide anywhere in the world's oceans, undetectable, waiting to launch a retaliatory strike if the Soviet Union ever attacked first. This was called second strike capability, and it was the foundation of mutually assured destruction. The logic was elegant and terrible. If the Soviets launched a first strike against the United States, American land-based missiles might be destroyed. American bomber bases might be vaporized. But somewhere in the depths of the Pacific or the Atlantic, American submarines would survive, and those submarines would unleash a retaliatory holocaust that would destroy Soviet civilization in return. Because both sides knew this. Because both sides understood that no first strike could succeed, neither side would dare to attack. The threat of mutual annihilation kept the peace. But that logic depended on one critical assumption: that American submarines could not be found. If Soviet attack submarines could suddenly track American boomers, if they could find them, follow them, and sink them before they could launch, then the entire strategic balance would shift. The Soviets might believe they could win a nuclear war. And if they believed they could win, they might be tempted to try. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the clock was ticking. In a secure conference room deep beneath the Pentagon, a crisis meeting convened in the winter of 1988. Around the table sat admirals, intelligence chiefs, submarine commanders, and representatives from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. The topic? How to counter the Akula threat. Gentlemen, Admiral Carlisle Trost, the Chief of Naval Operations, began, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. We have a problem. For the first time in 30 years, we cannot guarantee the survivability of our ballistic missile submarine fleet. He paused, letting the words sink in. If we cannot find these Akulas, we cannot kill them. And if we cannot kill them before they find our boomers, our entire nuclear strategy is at risk. Everything we've built, everything we've relied on for 40 years, all of it depends on solving this problem. The room fell silent. These were men accustomed to challenges, to difficult problems, to finding solutions where none seemed to exist. But this was different. This was existential. Captain James Richardson, commander of Submarine Squadron 7, spoke first. Admiral, with respect, we've been tracking Soviet submarines for decades. Our sonar technology is the best in the world. How is it possible that we're suddenly blind? Trost's expression was grim. The Akula isn't like anything we've faced before. Its acoustic signature is below our detection threshold in most conditions. Even when we do pick it up, distinguishing it from background ocean noise requires hours of analysis. In a shooting war, Captain, we wouldn't have hours. We might not even have minutes. The numbers were staggering. American intelligence estimated that the Soviets planned to build at least 40 Akula-class submarines over the next decade. Each one would cost approximately $90 million, a bargain by any standard, especially compared to the Los Angeles-class boats the U.S. Navy was producing at nearly $900 million per copy. But the real problem wasn't production costs. The real problem was that the fundamental assumption underlying American naval supremacy, that Soviet submarines would always be louder than American sensors, had been proven wrong. The game had changed, and nobody in that room knew what the new rules were. Well, we need a new approach, said Dr. Craig Fields, the director of DARPA. We need to detect these submarines by methods other than passive acoustics. We need to find what they can't silence. What Fields proposed was ambitious, bordering on impossible. If passive acoustics couldn't find the Akulas, then perhaps other signatures could be exploited. Every submarine disturbs the environment around it in ways beyond sound. It creates temperature variations as warm reactor coolant heats the surrounding water. The heat rises, creating subtle thermal plumes that might be detectable from above. It leaves chemical traces, traces of lubricating oil that seep through shaft seals, traces of reactor coolant that escape through microscopic leaks, traces of the very metals from which the hull is built, slowly dissolving into the salt water. It generates minute electrical fields from its onboard systems, navigation computers, weapons control systems, life support equipment. All of these create electromagnetic signatures that might, theoretically, be detected. It disturbs the water itself, creating wake patterns and turbulence that might be visible to satellites looking down from space. Each of these signatures was theoretically detectable. In practice, the technology to do so didn't exist. But the CIA and DARPA were determined to create it. The program was classified at the highest levels. Even most members of Congress didn't know it existed. Its official designation was Cluster Ranger, though few people inside the intelligence community ever spoke that name aloud. Its budget was initially set at $200 million over 5 years. That budget would eventually more than quadruple. The first major initiative was a complete overhaul of the SOSUS network. Engineers began installing new hydrophones with dramatically improved sensitivity, capable of detecting sounds at frequencies previously considered impossible to process. New signal processing algorithms, developed by mathematicians at the National Security Agency, could filter out background noise with unprecedented accuracy. The mathematics alone consumed years of effort. The ocean is not silent, it's filled with noise. The groaning of tectonic plates, the songs of whales, the crackle of snapping shrimp, the rumble of distant storms. Separating a submarine's signature from this cacophony was like trying to hear a whisper in a hurricane. But the NSA mathematicians were good, very good. They developed neural network algorithms decades before neural networks became fashionable. They created pattern recognition systems that could distinguish mechanical sounds from biological ones, man-made signatures from natural phenomena. The improvements helped. They helped enough to track some Akulas in some conditions, but some wasn't good enough. In a nuclear war, some meant not enough. The second initiative was more exotic, non-acoustic detection. DARPA funded research into magnetic anomaly detection, MAD, which could theoretically sense the magnetic disturbance created by a submarine's steel hull moving through Earth's magnetic field. But MAD had severe limitations. It required aircraft to fly directly over a submarine's position, and its range was measured in hundreds of feet, not miles. Against a quiet, deep-running Akula that could hear aircraft approaching from miles away, MAD was almost useless. Thermal detection showed theoretical promise. Submarines generate heat, reactor heat, equipment heat, the body heat of 100 crewmen living in a steel tube. That heat eventually reaches the water surrounding the boat, creating subtle temperature variations that might be detectable from space. But subtle was an understatement. The temperature difference between a submarine's wake and the surrounding ocean was measured in fractions of a degree. Satellite sensors of the era couldn't reliably detect such variations through hundreds of feet of seawater. The technology simply wasn't mature enough. Chemical detection received significant funding. Submarines inevitably leak trace amounts of various compounds, lubricants, coolants, even oxygen from their air purification systems. DARPA funded research into underwater sniffers that could detect these chemicals at concentrations measured in parts per billion. The technology worked brilliantly in laboratory conditions. In the open ocean, it was overwhelmed by natural chemical variations. The sea itself contains trace amounts of thousands of compounds, and distinguishing submarine leakage from natural background proved virtually impossible. Blue-green laser detection was another avenue explored. Blue-green light penetrates seawater more effectively than other wavelengths. In theory, a sufficiently powerful laser mounted on a satellite or aircraft could illuminate a submarine hundreds of feet below the surface, and the reflection could be detected. In practice, the laser power required was enormous, and the submarine could see the laser coming long before it could be detected. Any Akula commander watching his sensors would simply dive deeper or change course, rendering the detection useless. 3 years and $300 million later, Cluster Ranger had produced no breakthrough. The Akula remained a ghost. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet naval commanders were celebrating. Admiral Vladimir Chernavin, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, understood exactly what the Akula represented. For the first time since the 1940s, the Soviet Union had a weapon that could challenge American naval supremacy, not through numbers or sacrifice, but through pure technological capability. The Americans have grown complacent, Chernavin told the Politburo in a classified briefing in January 1989. For 40 years, they have believed their technology superior. They have believed their submarines undetectable, while ours were naked before their sensors. The Akula proves them wrong. The Akula proves that Soviet engineering can match or exceed anything the capitalist can produce. The assembled party members listened with satisfaction. This was what they wanted to hear. This was validation of the socialist system, proof that the Soviet Union could compete with the West on its own terms. What Chernavin didn't mention, what would have dampened the mood considerably, was the cost. Each Akula came in at approximately $90 million, expensive by Soviet standards, a significant fraction of the Navy's procurement budget. And while $90 million was a bargain compared to American submarines, it was still real money in an economy that was slowly strangling itself. The planned fleet of 40 Akulas would require $3.5 billion, and that was only the construction cost. Operating a nuclear submarine fleet required trained crews, maintenance facilities, nuclear fuel, and a logistics infrastructure that stretched across the entire country. The true cost was many times the sticker price. But Chernavin kept these concerns to himself. In the Soviet system, admirals who emphasized problems over successes did not remain admirals for long. The Soviets had another secret, a secret that, if the Americans had known, might have changed everything. The Akula worked so well because the Soviets had known exactly what to optimize. They had known exactly which frequencies American sonar listened for. They had known exactly which signatures American detection systems used to identify submarines. They had known because someone had told them. That someone was John Anthony Walker, Jr. Walker was a retired Navy warrant officer, a career communication specialist who had spent 18 years selling classified information to the Soviet Union. From 1967 to 1985, Walker had provided the KGB with encryption keys, communications procedures, and technical manuals describing American naval systems in extraordinary detail. Among the documents Walker provided were detailed specifications of American sonar systems, their operating frequencies, their detection thresholds, their blind spots. He gave the Soviets a complete roadmap to American undersea surveillance. Armed with this intelligence, Soviet engineers hadn't been shooting in the dark. They had known exactly what they needed to defeat. Every design decision on the Akula was informed by Walker's treachery. The Walker spy ring was finally rolled up in 1985, after Walker's own wife tipped off the FBI following their divorce. Walker was arrested, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. He died in federal custody in 2014, never having expressed remorse. But the damage had already been done. The secrets had already been transmitted. The knowledge had already been incorporated into Soviet submarine design. The Americans had, in a very real sense, taught the Soviets how to beat them. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Akula story. It wasn't just about technology or money. It wasn't just about propeller machining or anechoic tiles. It was about betrayal. It was about secrets sold for silver. It was about the fragility of even the most sophisticated military systems when confronted with human weakness. And here's the cruel irony. Even knowing what Walker had told them, even knowing that American detection methods had been compromised, the intelligence community never fully adapted. They continued relying on SOSUS. They continued assuming that Soviet submarines would be loud. They continued operating as if the old rules still applied. When the Akula appeared, they were caught flat-footed. Not because the intelligence didn't exist, Walker's treachery had been analyzed in detail, but because the bureaucracy couldn't process the implications. The Navy had invested too much in the old way of doing things. Admirals had built careers on acoustic supremacy. Admitting that the game had changed meant admitting that everything they believed was wrong. And so they didn't, not until reality forced them to. This pattern, the pattern of institutional inertia, of fighting the last war, of refusing to adapt until catastrophe strikes, is as old as warfare itself. Back in Washington, as Cluster Ranger consumed hundreds of millions of dollars without producing results, a parallel effort was underway. If the Akula couldn't be detected reliably, perhaps it could be countered with an even better submarine. In 1989, the Navy launched the most expensive submarine program in American history, the Seawolf class. The Seawolf was designed with one purpose: to hunt and kill Akulas. Every system, every component, every design decision flowed from that single objective. If the Akula was quiet, the Seawolf would be quieter. If the Akula was fast, the Seawolf would be faster. If the Akula could dive deep, the Seawolf would dive deeper. The specifications were extraordinary, pushing the boundaries of what naval architects thought possible. The Seawolf would be the quietest submarine ever built, with a radiated noise level 10 times lower than the improved Los Angeles class. Where the Los Angeles could be detected under certain conditions, the Seawolf would be virtually silent. It would carry 50 weapons, torpedoes, missiles, mines, more than any attack submarine in history. Where Los Angeles carried 26 weapons, the Seawolf would carry nearly double, giving it unprecedented endurance in combat. Its maximum speed, classified to this day, was rumored to exceed 35 knots, faster than most surface ships, and it could maintain that speed in near silence, a combination previously thought impossible. Its test depth was over 2,000 feet, allowing it to hide in the thermal layers and pressure zones where other submarines couldn't follow. The hull was constructed from HY-100 steel, stronger than anything used in previous American submarines. It would be, in short, the ultimate predator, a shark designed to hunt other sharks. It would also cost over $3 billion per hull. When the first budget estimates reached Congress, there was disbelief. Some members of the Senate Armed Services Committee thought there had been a calculation error. $3 billion was more than the entire annual budget of some federal agencies. It was more than the cost of an aircraft carrier. It was more money than many members of Congress could comprehend spending on a single vessel. But the Navy was insistent. The Soviet threat demanded nothing less. "Gentlemen," Admiral Frank Kelso testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in the spring of 1990, "we are facing a peer competitor for the first time since World War II. The Akula-class submarine represents a quantum leap in Soviet capability. Our existing submarines cannot reliably detect or track these boats. Our detection networks are being rendered obsolete. If we do not respond in kind, we risk losing control of the undersea battle space, and with it, the survivability of our nuclear deterrent." The committee listened. The threat was real. The vulnerability was genuine. In the context of 1990, with the Cold War still seemingly permanent, the investment seemed justified. The committee approved the funding. The program moved forward. And then, 18 months later, the Soviet Union collapsed. The timing could not have been more ironic. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Red Banner Northern Fleet, once the most powerful naval force in Eurasia, suddenly belonged to a country that no longer existed. After years of panic, after hundreds of millions of dollars spent on detection programs, after billions committed to the Seawolf, the enemy simply ceased to exist. In the harbors of Murmansk and Severomorsk, Akula submarines sat at their piers, unmaintained. Their crews, unpaid for months, drifted away to find work in the new capitalist economy. Reactor maintenance schedules were missed. Fuel deliveries stopped. The submarines that had terrified American admirals began their slow descent into rust and decay. The Akula threat evaporated almost overnight. But the spending didn't stop, not immediately. In the chaos following the Soviet collapse, American intelligence agencies scrambled to understand what they had actually been facing. Teams of analysts descended on newly accessible Russian archives. Former Soviet naval officers, desperate for hard currency, were recruited as sources. Some of them came cheap, a few $1,000s for information that would have been worth millions during the Cold War. What they discovered was both reassuring and deeply troubling. On one hand, the Akula had never been quite as capable as the worst-case assessments suggested. Soviet quality control was maddeningly inconsistent. Some boats were remarkably quiet, matching or exceeding the specifications. Others suffered from manufacturing defects that made them nearly as detectable as their predecessors. The rubber anechoic tiles had a tendency to fall off in cold water. Some of the reactor isolation mounts had failed during sea trials. The planned fleet expansion had been a fantasy. The Soviet economy simply couldn't support the construction of 40 advanced submarines while simultaneously maintaining existing forces, building surface ships, and keeping up with the Army and Air Force demands for resources. Even the 15 boats that were completed had strained the system to its limits. But on the other hand, the core technology was real. The Akula's design represented a genuine breakthrough, and the best boats in the class were every bit as dangerous as the Navy had feared. The combination of the Toshiba Kongsberg milling machines and the Walker intelligence had allowed the Soviets to leapfrog decades of acoustic research. And the lessons learned in building the Akula hadn't disappeared with the Soviet flag. They had been inherited by the Russian Federation, and they were being shopped to anyone with hard currency. In the years following the Soviet collapse, Russian submarine technology proliferated around the world. China purchased Kilo-class submarines, the Akula's diesel-electric cousin, and began reverse engineering Soviet designs. Within a decade, Chinese shipyards were producing their own quiet submarines, incorporating lessons learned from decades of Soviet research. India leased an Akula-class boat for training purposes in the 2000s, gaining first-hand experience with its capabilities. The Indian Navy used that knowledge to develop its own nuclear submarine program. Even Iran expressed interest in acquiring Russian submarine technology, though international sanctions limited what they could actually obtain. The Ghost had spawned an army of children. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Seawolf program stumbled toward completion. The first boat, USS Seawolf, was commissioned in 1997, 6 years behind schedule and billions over budget. The second, USS Connecticut, followed in 1998. The third, USS Jimmy Carter, was completed in 2005 after extensive modifications for special operations that added yet another billion to its cost. And then the program ended. Only 3 Seawolf submarines were built out of a planned 29. Each one had cost approximately $3 billion. Do the math. 3 boats at $3 billion each, $9 billion to counter a threat that had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist before the first hull hit the water. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Here's the detail that Pentagon officials still don't like to discuss publicly. The Akula worked. Not in the sense that it ever sank an American submarine or launched a nuclear strike. The Cold War ended without a shot being fired between the superpowers. No Akula ever fired a torpedo in anger. No Akula ever launched a cruise missile at an American target. But in terms of its strategic objective, in terms of what Soviet naval planners actually designed it to do, the Akula was a complete success. Its purpose was never to sink American ships. Its purpose was to force the Americans into an arms race they couldn't sustain. Its purpose was to drain resources from other military priorities. Its purpose was to create uncertainty, to inject doubt into the calculus of nuclear deterrence, to force American planners to consider possibilities they had thought safely eliminated. And by all those measures, it succeeded brilliantly. The Cluster Ranger program consumed nearly $500 million before it was quietly terminated in 1993. The Seawolf program ate $9 billion. Related research initiatives, intelligence operations, and infrastructure upgrades added hundreds of millions more. Total cost to the American taxpayer, conservatively, over $800 million in direct Akula-related countermeasures, with billions more in secondary effects. Total cost to the Soviet Union, approximately $90 million per submarine, with 15 boats completed before the collapse. Roughly $1.5 billion total, less than the cost of a single Seawolf. The ratio is almost absurd. For every dollar the Soviets spent on an Akula, the Americans spent nearly $6 trying to counter it. And in the end, what did those $6 buy? 3 submarines that were too expensive to produce in quantity, a detection network that was obsolete before it was completed, a generation of naval officers who had been trained to fight an enemy that no longer existed. The Akula didn't win the Cold War for the Soviet Union. Nothing could have done that. The internal contradictions of the communist system, the economic stagnation, the political repression, these were forces no submarine could overcome. But the Akula demonstrated something profound about the nature of military competition. It proved that asymmetric strategies could work, that a weaker power could impose costs on a stronger one far exceeding its own investment. It was a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten. Let me tell you about one more incident, one more moment that captures the essence of this entire story. It was August 10th, 2009, the Gulf of Mexico, approximately 200 miles south of New Orleans. The USS Houston, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, was conducting routine patrol operations in waters the American Navy considered completely secure. The Gulf of Mexico was an American lake, a place where Soviet submarines had never dared to venture during the Cold War. What happened next remains partially classified to this day. According to reports that leaked to the press, the Houston detected an unknown submarine contact operating in the Gulf. The contact was brief, a few minutes of faint acoustic signature before it disappeared into the background noise. The Navy publicly denied that any foreign submarine had penetrated the Gulf, but privately, intelligence analysts reached a different conclusion. The contact was consistent with an Akula-class submarine. A Russian Akula in the Gulf of Mexico, 18 years after the Soviet collapse. The Russian Navy had sent a message. The ghost was still there, still capable, still silent enough to slip past American defenses and operate in waters that the United States considered inviolate. Whether this incident actually occurred, as reported, remains disputed. The Navy has never confirmed it. Russian officials have neither confirmed nor denied it. But among submarine officers, the story is told as truth. And whether or not a Russian Akula actually sailed into the Gulf of Mexico in 2009, the fact that American officers believed it could speaks volumes. The ghost had never really died. Today, the remaining Akula-class submarines continue to serve in the Russian Navy, though their numbers have dwindled through age and poor maintenance. The boats that terrified American admirals in the 1980s are now approaching the end of their operational lives, their hulls corroded, their systems obsolete by modern standards. They are being replaced by newer designs. The Yasin class, first deployed in 2014, incorporates lessons learned from the Akula program and adds capabilities that Cold War designers could only dream of. American naval officers who have tracked Yasin submarines describe them in unguarded moments as the most capable adversaries they've ever faced. The legacy of the Akula extends far beyond the rusting hulls in Russian ports. In the South China Sea, Chinese submarines based on Soviet designs patrol waters that American forces once dominated unchallenged. The Chinese Navy operates over 60 submarines today, including nuclear-powered attack boats that incorporate lessons learned from the Akula program. Their newest designs are approaching Western levels of quietness, and they're being produced at a rate the United States cannot match. In the Indian Ocean, Indian submarines trained by former Soviet officers operate with increasing confidence and capability. Even in the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, the specter of quiet, diesel-electric submarines, descendants of the technology that made the Akula possible, constrains American naval operations in ways that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. The ghost is multiplied, the ocean grows more crowded, and the fundamental problem that kept Pentagon officials awake in 1987 remains unsolved. How do you find what you cannot hear? The Navy continues to search for answers. New detection technologies are under development, their details classified at the highest levels. Artificial intelligence systems are being trained to analyze acoustic data, looking for patterns too subtle for human operators to detect. Unmanned underwater vehicles are being designed to patrol vast stretches of ocean, creating persistent surveillance networks that would have seemed like science fiction in 1987. Whether any of these efforts will succeed is impossible to know. The history of undersea warfare is a history of measures and countermeasures, of innovation and adaptation, of hunters becoming hunted and hunted becoming hunters. What we can say with certainty is this: the comfortable supremacy that American submarines enjoyed from 1945 to 1984 is gone. It was destroyed by Soviet ingenuity, by Japanese machine tools, by Norwegian industrial equipment, and by the treason of a Navy man named Walker. It cost $90 million to build the weapon that ended that supremacy. It cost $800 million to realize that ending had arrived. And it cost something beyond calculation, something in confidence, in certainty, in the simple faith that American technology would always prevail, to accept that in this contest, at least, the other side had won. Some victories can't be measured in dollars, some losses can't be calculated in ships sunk or battles fought. The Akula sank no American vessel. It fought no engagement. It fired no weapon in anger. But it changed everything. Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes retired from the Navy in 1995. In his final fitness report, his commanding officer noted that Hayes had completed a distinguished career with unwavering dedication to the submarine service. What the fitness report didn't mention was that November night in 1987, The night when Hayes lost to contact for the first time in his career. The night when he realized that the world had changed beneath his feet. Hayes never spoke publicly about that night. He never gave interviews. He never wrote memoirs. When former shipmates asked about it, he would change the subject or excuse himself from the conversation. But his children remember something. They remember their father in his later years, sitting on the porch of his home in Virginia Beach, staring at the ocean, staring for hours, sometimes, as if searching for something in the waves. "They're still out there," he told his son once, unprompted, shortly before his death in 2012. His voice was distant, almost reverent, somewhere in the deep, waiting, listening. His son asked him what he meant. Hayes didn't answer. He just kept staring at the water. Some questions are destined to remain unanswered. Some ghosts are destined to remain unseen. The ocean keeps its secrets well. And somewhere in the cold, dark waters of the world's oceans, something is still listening. In the end, perhaps that's the real lesson of the Akula. Not that Soviet technology was superior, not that American spending was wasteful, but that in warfare, as in so many things, the race doesn't always go to the swift. Sometimes it goes to the clever. Sometimes it goes to the patient. Sometimes it goes to those who understand that the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that destroys. It's the one that can't be seen. The most dangerous weapon is the one that makes your enemy doubt everything he thought he knew. The Akula was that weapon. And the $800 million America spent trying to counter it, that wasn't the cost of failure. That was the cost of fear. The ocean is vast, the ocean is dark, and somewhere in that darkness the sharks are still swimming. Silent, patient, invisible, waiting for the next hunt to begin. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself gripped by this tale of Cold War intrigue, technological warfare, and the hidden battles that shaped our world, then consider subscribing to this channel. We bring you stories like this every week, stories that reveal the secrets behind the headlines, the truth behind the propaganda, the human drama behind the statistics. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, and leave a comment below. What do you think the next revolution in submarine warfare will be? Will artificial intelligence tip the balance? Will autonomous drones change the game? I read every comment, and your insights often inspire future videos. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed. And never forget, beneath the surface, the real battles are still being fought. Some of them may never end.